All right, let's get into it. We're about to unpack a story that stretches across decades. A story about a lost homeland, a silence that was forced upon a people, and a new generation's fight to get it all back. This is the story of Egypt's Nubian people and their incredibly long struggle for the right of return. We all remember the images from 2011. Tahrir Square, a whole nation rising up. But inside that massive political earthquake, another story, a much older one, was finally finding its voice. A story that had been buried for half a century was about to have its moment on those very same streets. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the feeling on the ground. For young Nubian activists, the revolution wasn't just about getting rid of a dictator. It was this once-in-a-lifetime, incredibly high-stakes opportunity. After decades of being silenced, they felt the ground shift beneath them, and it created a tiny window to make demands that had always been seen as a threat to the state. But to really get what they were fighting for, we've got to go back. So how did all of this even begin? Well, the root of this whole modern struggle is a national project that for the Nubian people wasn't progress, it was a cataclysm. It was the moment their entire world was literally drowned. See, the Aswan High Dam was the crown jewel of President Gamal Abdel Nasser's vision for a modern, powerful Egypt. It was going to bring electricity to everyone and finally control the Nile's floods. But there was a catch, a huge one. For that national dream to come true, the ancient land of Nubia had to be sacrificed. And it was all framed as a patriotic duty, something they had to do for the greater good of Egypt. And you have to understand the human scale of this sacrifice. 50,000 people, an entire community just forcibly removed from the lands their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years, all along the beautiful, fertile banks of the Nile. And it wasn't just their homes, it was their entire economy, their whole way of life. 4 million palm trees. Just let that number sink in. These trees were the absolute cornerstone of Nubian life. They were a massive source of cultural and economic wealth. And they were all submerged under the rising waters of what we now call Lake Nasser. And what happened next? It's just hard to even talk about. The resettlement was a catastrophic failure. In the very first year after they were moved, a staggering 90% of children under the age of 7 died, mostly from dehydration. The cemeteries became known as the nursery because they were filled almost entirely with children. And behind that horrifying number are stories. Individual tragedies. This is the story of Zainab Gonia. She actually gave birth on one of the displacement boats with no doctor. She died from a fever soon after, and her baby, who she named Hagar, a name that references migration, died just a few days later. This is the human cost of that national project. The sense of betrayal was just profound. The Nubians were promised brand new villages right on the banks of the Nile so they could continue their way of life. Instead, when they got there, buses were waiting. They were driven 40 kilometers deep into the harsh desert to these resettlement camps in a place the locals called the Valley of the Spirits. Their river, their lifeblood, was gone. So after a trauma of this magnitude, you'd expect a massive, immediate political backlash, right? But for almost 2 generations, there was this strange, heavy silence. So the question is why? What on earth could possibly suppress a story this powerful for so long? Well, it turns out it wasn't just one thing, but this kind of perfect storm of pressures. First, you had Nasser's very powerful brand of Egyptian Arab nationalism, which pushed this idea of a single, unified identity and basically erased minorities. Then, Nubians faced systematic marginalization. They were often stereotyped and pushed into low-wage work. Third, the state itself saw any kind of minority organizing as a security threat, as separatism. And finally, and this is crucial, the community itself was fragmented, split up by geography and different ideas about what to do. But that kind of silence, it can't last forever. A new generation, people born after the displacement but who grew up with these stories, they began to find their voice. And they started using new tools and grabbing new opportunities to finally break that silence. And you can actually trace the momentum. Things really started to pick up around 2008. The bread crisis protests showed a whole new generation of Egyptians, including Nubians, how powerful social media could be for organizing. That experience fed directly into 2011, when the revolution blew the doors open for street protests. And all that energy was then channeled into the next big political battle, the fight over the new constitution in 2014. Now, this is where things get really interesting and strategic. The activist had this major dilemma. How do you make your case without being branded a traitor? So they basically used two different approaches. The human rights frame was really direct. It demanded return as a fundamental right. But the state saw this as confrontational, even separatist. So then you had the development frame, which was, frankly, brilliant. They started using the government's own language, arguing that letting Nubians return would actually help develop the region and fulfill the state's own promises from the 60s. So this new wave of activism, using these incredibly smart strategies, led to something historic, something that for many was an unimaginable breakthrough, a victory that was about to be written into the highest law of the land. And here it is, Article 236 of the 2014 Constitution. For the first time in the history of Egypt, the word Nubia was officially in a legal text. And it wasn't just a mention, it directly acknowledged a right of return, committing the state to bringing Nubians back to their original lands within 10 years. This was a monumental achievement. And that, of course, brings us to the essential question. Winning a legal battle is one thing, but turning words on a piece of paper into actual homes, into a living community back on the banks of the Nile, that's a whole different challenge. The victory was real, but the journey was a long, long way from being over. Because almost as soon as the ink was dry on that new constitution, new and, frankly, massive obstacles started to appear. And they showed everyone just how fragile that victory really was. This is the biggest hurdle they face today. It's called Presidential Decree 444. What it did was reclassify huge areas of land along Egypt's southern border as restricted military zones. And, wouldn't you know it, those zones just happen to include 16 of the very villages that are central to the Nubian plan for return. It was a move that directly contradicted the entire spirit of the Constitution. And so, this leaves us with the central question that the Nubian people are still grappling with today. When your homeland exists almost entirely in memory, what does it actually take to finally go home? After losing the land itself, fighting through generations of silence, winning a right on paper only to see it blocked by new decrees, what comes next? The story of their return is still being written.